Mark Ellington arrived in Whisper Lake on a cold, gray morning, when the town looked as if it had been folded into the edge of the world and left there to molder. The highway had spat him out at a single blinking light, and from that road the town sloped down toward a black glass of water that the locals called, with a kind of private reverence, Whisper Lake. He'd come because a nameless editorial voice had told him to, because a tip, then an offhand line in a police blotter, then a family friend at the paper's county desk had all suggested there was something in the case worth seeing with his own two eyes. He had spent a career following the quiet mysteries people would sooner swallow than speak. Whisper Lake promised the sort of silence that made a man listen harder. He found the town small and suspicious in a way that city people could mistake for friendliness. The cafe was one room warm and smelled like frying bacon and coffee. The counter lined with old men who watched him while pretending not to. The gas station clerk, a patched jacket woman with a faded wedding band, gave him directions to the cabins and said, "They don't like strangers much. Mostly they don't like trouble." Mark shrugged and said he was a journalist. "Oh," the woman said, and the conversation ended. Thomas Hale's absence was the kind of absence that announced itself without fanfare. He had been an unassuming man, retired cartographer, 3 sons away in different towns, a single daughter who'd stayed. The last anyone saw him, he'd been walking the lake path at dusk, muttering to himself about lights and voices coming from the deep. He'd left a note in his house's kitchen drawer, an odd, wet-splotched page, saved in a tin box with a half-burned candle. "The water remembers faces," the note read in Thomas's careful hand. "It shows you what you are trying not to be." Mark rented the smallest cabin available, a plank-sided slice of shelter the owner called the Finch. At night the town's roofs breathed, and the hills kept their secrets close. The owls sounded like question marks. In the dark of his first evening, Mark heard it, a soft whispering, so faint he thought it was the wind at first. "Mark," it said. He froze. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps the mind does what the mind wants when it is looking for story. He turned on every light and drank coffee until dawn. He told himself he would be clinical, that he would not let the town's atmospherics provide the juicier confabulations to hang a piece on. He went to the library to read old papers and microfilm, to travel the town's well-trod past. That's where he found the first, half-hidden puzzle. 38 years before, a group of 17 campers had gone missing from Whisper Lake in a single, terrible night. They never came back, and there were no bodies, no scattered gear, no damp prints leading into the trees. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The town dealt with the trauma by talking around it, not through it. People lit candles at the bandstand on years that marked the anniversary of the disappearance, but few ever spoke of what happened beyond the ritual. Some whispered that the lake was old in ways that mattered, older than maps. Others said the missing had been swallowed by their own bad decisions. "Don't go poking at that history," the librarian said as she stamped his research card. Her hands were dry and quick. "It makes the water angry." Mark smiled, because he always smiled, and because he knew the job asked him to go where others would not. To pull the thread and see how the sweater unraveled. He started with small interviews. The mayor, who gave answers to neat. A teacher, who looked as if she had been rehearsing condolences for years. The funeral director, who did not look amused at all. One by one, people offered him things to take away, old photographs, scrawled notes, recollections of the missing that only deepened the knot. The town smelled of damp wood and old answers. Elliot, a weathered man who'd made a living steering other people's boats around the lake, met Mark by the dock at dawn and smoked unfiltered cigarettes like they were tiny torches he carried against the cold. Elliot's skin had the leathered look of someone who had spent his life facing the surface of a shifting mirror. He smoked, listened, and when he spoke, his voice came like a thread pulled from a muted spool. "It's not just about Thomas," Elliot said, cupping his hands around his cigarette for warmth. "We lost people before. Things ways is not the same here. The water carries it. You ever see how it sits? Like it's waiting for a command. He coughed. Thomas told me once he saw a light beneath. He told someone else Agnes he'd seen a face. Elliot's voice dropped, as if mentioning the lake itself might make it act on them. He tapped ash into the water and watched the ripples die. Agnes lived at the town's edge, in a house half sunken into the roots of the mountain, and her front porch gabled like a shark's jaw over a pot of midnight geraniums. She was older than the older men who loitered at the diner, and her eyes were a pale green that looked like something seashells might possess. Everybody knew Agnes had a tongue that did not spare and a memory like a ledger. Mark found her stirring a kettle when he introduced himself. "You'd do better if you left," she told him, blunt as hardware. "These folks don't like their own bones rattled up, much less an outsider with a typewriter." Mark explained, the practiced pitch of a reporter, not easily unlearned. Agnes set the kettle down and looked out beyond the porch, past pastures, and then the black water itself. "Thomas heard the water," she said eventually. "You weren't the first." He wasn't the first to say a thing like that. Thomas He was a good man. Mapmaker maps is how he measured the world. He thought the lake could be measured. Some things can't be bounded with lines. My father, your father, if you were old, here would have told you to leave it. She smiled then, the smile of a woman who knew how to watch a person's resolve erode. "But you're not him. You're stubborn. Fine. Just don't look beneath too long." Mark's notes filled. Fragments of memory from the town. Pieces of maps Thomas had once drawn with hands that knew contour lines and riverbed. Thomas's daughter, Sadie, looked at Mark like he'd come in place of something someone owed her. He talked about the water like it knew him, she told Mark one evening, tears stray bright in her eyes. He said it called in voices he didn't know how to answer. He'd change after those walks, like he'd been looking at something that didn't belong to him. Mark started his nights at the lake with a borrowed flashlight and a camera with a lens the size of a dinner plate. He walked the path with a pair of boots that sucked at the mud and his breath short and visible. The water would lie there like ink, an oil-black calm that reflected nothing but his own headlamp. At first, there was only the distant croak of frogs, the hollow groan of the trees. But on the third night, he heard a thinner sound, like someone running a dry finger over the lip of a glass. "Mark," it said, very close to his ear this time, a voice that could have been wind if it had no intention. He turned so quickly, his flashlight made a starburst on the surface. There was nothing. Then the water shifted, a faint luminescence folding up beneath the skin of the lake like a breath. A pale line of light moved slowly under the glass, as if someone had traced a finger under a pane. Mark's camera shutter clicked, and then showed him nothing but reflections. In the morning the images would be fogged and useless. Sleep became an uneven thing. He dreamed in the voice of the lake, long, low vowels and syllables that felt like being called by a name that was not yours. He dreamt of a field of old tents and laughter, and then of the soft boom of oaken oars hitting water. In one vivid dream he watched a party of people move to the water's edge, the night sky full of pale lanterns, and then the lake opened like a mouth and took them. He would wake with the taste of the deep on his tongue. The town grew less polite. Someone he never learned who broke a bottle on his windowsill. The sheriff, a man whose role was to suggest accommodations, and little else, told Mark that sometimes things were better left alone. "There are fishing lines you can't cut," the sheriff said, leaning against his cruiser as though it were a bar counter. "There are folks who like the quiet, because their bones remember what's beneath it. You stir a pond, and the muck comes up." The turning point came 3 weeks into his stay. He had taken to paging through Thomas's old notebooks, who had been precise and elegant, with lines and curves. A man who had once charted contours, and could have told you the slope of a hillside before you felt the fatigue in your calves. There, folded into the back of a ledger, was a scrap of paper with one sentence in Thomas's typed, ordinary handwriting. "The face I saw beneath the moon was mine with 20 years added. Mark felt a preposterous cold in his stomach. He sat and reread the sentence as if it might rearrange itself into clearer meaning. He thought of the way the lake called, and of Thomas's final days, how he had gone later and later into the evenings and come home quieter, as if a whole other language had settled into him. He thought of Elliot's cigarette ash and Agnes's pot of worrying water by the window. He thought of the 17 people who had vanished without a trace. He thought of his own reflection in the water, and how the face had always looked back with a small, patient contempt. That night, he waited. He positioned himself on the dock and watched as fog unspooled across the surface, thickening until the world was muffled. He felt as if he were being watched by something that had the patience of geological age. The only other sound was his own breath and the soft creak of wood. Then, like someone opening a secret door, the lake brightened from within a low, living light, like the belly of some great fish. He saw shapes moving under the water, not quite human, not quite animal. Shapes that were more memory than body. The water's light focused and then pulled itself up, and as it did, Mark saw with a clarity that was not the camera's that an older man's face was forming in the glow. It watched him with the eyes of recognition. It spoke his name. Mark, you don't belong to it. The face, weathered and ancient, had his jawline, his furrow, the small crinkles at the eyes. It was him, only older, and older by decades. Go back, the older self said. This place will not give you what you came for. Mark felt his knees suddenly heavy and his chest tight. Something pulled the air from him. The lake's surface shifted and tugged at his boots, as if testing how deep he would stand. He wanted to run. He wanted to ask the face why it knew him. The voice continued, not loud and not soft, the way a well-rehearsed truth might be spoken. I was once like you, the older Mark said. Come close enough, and the lake will show you what you hunger for. Then it will demand you keep the hunger. It takes a while to mean to forget. It's patient. The face faded like a photograph. The light sank into the water like a coin. Mark left the dock with the taste of iron in his mouth and a numbness that pulled at his knees. He thought at first that he'd been spared. He thought at first that maybe he'd been given a warning. But a warning is only as useful as the ear that hears it. He packed a bag that night with the intent to drive back to the city and send a story that would make someone rich with clicks and sympathy. He folded the pages of Thomas's ledger with careful, almost tender hands. In the taxi to the station, he felt a strange compulsion to go to Agnes's house one last time. Agnes was on the porch when he stopped, knitting, the rhythm of her hands unperturbed by his arrival. She looked at him and, without preamble, said, "You saw it?" He nodded. Agnes regarded him as if he'd brought her something fragile and terrible. "So you know," she said, "it will let you leave if it can. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it gives you a future to watch and makes you carry it like a stone." She rose, hands on the railing. "Do you want to know how I knew? Because I did it once and came back. Don't look at me like that. We all do things when we're young, and the lake is very good at remembering." Mark's laugh came out thin. "You were." Agnes's eyes were clear. "A girl who pushed a boy off a dock and watched the ripples. I am old because I remembered the weight of that choice. The lake teaches you ways of being small and afraid. It will show you what your life would look like if you let it, and then it will ask you to keep it secret." He left without a plan, and thought he could outrun whatever it was that had crawled into his head. 4 months afterwards, he told himself he had not seen himself on the dock, that the face had been a trick the fog played, that it was a city man's hunger for narrative seeing itself in water. He had other things. A wife who liked the wines he did not yet know how to decant. An apartment with a balcony in a neighborhood that smelled like rain and takeaway. He filed a thin piece, careful, observant, but the piece found no traction. Editors wanted the sensational without the hush. They wanted crisp moral arcs, not the sticky, hungry places where a lake kept people in debt. Years scabbed over the newness of the memory. And then pictures began to surface in the town archives. A grainy photograph found in a box of a decades-old festival. A man on the far right, who looked remarkably like Mark Ellington, older in ways he could recognize now. He was an old man in the photo, heavy-jowled, shoulders bent against a wind that struck from the north. Mark sat with the photo and the coastline of his life, and he felt the pull of gravity that was not only geological, but metaphysical. Time, as it does, narrowed and then spread. Mark would find himself driving through country, the radio static filling the car, feeling sometimes all at once that he had left something waiting. He would think of Thomas in the ledger and the lake's light. Sometimes he called Sadie on her birthday and left messages he deleted before she could hear them. Sometimes he broke things he loved. He read about disappearing men and other towns' youths who simply walked into woods and were never seen. He tried to write books about place and memory, but the sentences came fractured and refused to join. There was a particular vacuum where full nights used to be. There was a hunger that showed itself in his sleep as the echo of the lake's voice, a soft, long call. On a late afternoon 7 years after he'd first come to Whisper Lake, Mark took a wrong turn. He had started at the city, then to the highway, and before he could name the thought, his hands had steered him back to the hills where fog hung like old lace. It was easier than he expected to find the turnoff where the town sat like a jewel in a crevice. His car felt unfamiliar. He felt older. The town had not changed much. The Finch still rented cabins, and the diner still put too much pepper in its soup. People looked at him with the same guarded curiosity, more tolerant this time because the town had a mythology, and he fit into it. He stopped at the dock at dusk. The water lay dark but brightened, here and there with the glow that could be a fish or a memory. He could hear his name like a thin bell. He felt ridiculous for coming, and for staying. Then he saw the old face in the water, only now, years sharpened. He recognized it as his own because it had become more true with long distance and time. The old man looked up out of the lake and did not speak. He only watched him, and Mark realized at last with a stinging clarity that there had been no imperative order to stop. It had been an invitation. The lake wanted company, and it had a way of turning visitors into keepers. He stepped forward until the water licked his ankles. The sensation of cold was immediate and primal. The reflection showed him how much he had lived, how much he had been drawn back. If the lake had been a mirror, it was also a patient tool. The surface broke and the old face emerged again, smiling not maliciously, but with a wounded recognition, as if greeting an old friend who had remembered the tune. It was himself in the years to come, and he understood, in a private, clean way, that his story and the lake's appetite had always been entangled. Not everyone goes, the older Mark said at last. Some leave, most don't. The lake is a custodian of the things we cannot say out loud. It keeps collections. It takes people like me and keeps them, well, essential. Mark, no longer young, but not old, either let the water close halfway up his calves. He thought of the choice that had been set before him, and the one he had wandered toward for so long. He thought of Thomas's ledger and Elliot's hands, and Agnes's porch knitting and Sadie's face. He thought of the 17 tents that had simply ceased to be. He thought of the ledger note. The face I saw beneath the moon was mine with 20 years added. When the lake pulled, it did not feel like an abduction. It felt, at first, like succumbing, like answering a presence that had lived long enough to be entitled to a favor. The water rose, and around his waist, and then his lungs. And he did not flail, because he had known the moment since the first night. The lake's invitation was always paradoxically a permission to be still. He thought that once you understood a place, you could never unknow it. You would always be available to its call. They spoke then, not in words, but in the thin music of thought. The lake asked him to watch, to keep something that was not a thing in the ordinary sense. It asked for a witness. It asked for a memory keeper, Someone whose days would be made of watching and whispering the histories back to the water when it needed to remember itself. Mark felt the years settle into his bones in reverse, and then in circles, like coral, layering over scales. He felt time as a series of rings. He did not think his heart stopped so much as he thought it agreed to a new ledger. Afterwards, after the time that the living count, Mark was present, and then absent, and present again. The townspeople would later claim that an older man had taken to walking the path at midnight, that he hummed the tune of another era, and bent over the water as if listening for a familiar voice. They called him the lake's shadow, the man who watched the surface and never quite blinked. He came to stand as if holding a place for those who would not return. On some nights, local teenagers swore they could see more than one man in the reflection, a row of faces from different years. A parade that the lake kept in amber taught sometimes. Sadie would look from the shore and see a face that looked like her father in certain light. She would stand for a small time and then leave, as if she were in a ritual of acceptance. Agnes, whenever she saw the old man, would nod in a way that was more like an absolution. Elliot continued to smoke, the little torches he carried lit, as if to keep the dark at bay. He would tell younger fishermen who asked that the lake had its ways, and to mind them. Mark never wrote the big book he had once imagined. He refused interviews when offered, and when someone left a microphone in the diner and tried to bait him with a line about his experience, he left before the question finished forming. He did not need fame as a kind of explanation. He had a place now that kept its own logic. In the gaps of sunlight between storms, he would sometimes gesture toward the water and say something to a child who asked. Children ask questions and do not get so quickly tired. He would tell them in a soft voice that some places remember more than we do. Some places are hungry, and they want to keep their collections tidy. He told them, with that odd, sideways compassion, to always think carefully about the shape of their goodbyes. Visitors, who did not know the story as Mark himself once had, would leave the town with a faint ache, the sense that they had been party to something not intended for the living. Journalists would come now and then, because that is what journalists do. Some published accounts were lush with metaphor and terrible with wrong assumptions. Others were cruelly reductive, but none of them could capture the way a face looks when it first recognizes itself in water that has seen too much. None of them could capture the quiet satisfaction of sitting so long that the lake acknowledges you by name. Years slid into one, another like pages in a ledger. Mark's hair silvered more than he expected, and there were lines at the edges of his mouth that would never entirely fade. The town's rituals became his life, the lighting of candles, the children who came to listen, the fishermen who fetched fish and then looked out at the mirror surface as if seeing an old friend. He knew, in the marrow of him, that when his own time had thinned to something more porous, a younger man would come, and the lake would show him a face that had his jawline and his own future lines. It would be patient. It would speak his name softly and offer a place at its table. When the day came and he felt the coolness of water around his ankles and the pull that had been an old promise, he did not feel sorrow so much as completeness. The lake's voice filled the space between his ribs and rewired what it meant to keep time. He looked up at the distant town lights and thought of Agnes's porch and Elliot's ash and Sadie's tired kindness. He had come to accept that, in some small way, he was protecting all the stories that had nowhere else to go, and so the cycle held. The lake kept its watch, and a man stood upon the dock and listened for the sound of his own name. The town learned, in its slow way, to leave the lake its medicine. New visitors would come, drawn by curiosity, and some would leave with more than they had planned to carry. The lake, patient as any archive, would reach into the future and pluck a face from time like a page. It would show that face the life it might have been, the life that could be swallowed and stored as a caution or as a muse. And sometimes, if the light was right, it would smile to itself and add another voice to the long chorus that hummed under its surface.